were two official inquiries into the sinking of the Titanic. A Senate investigation was organized and chaired by Senator William Alden Smith. The hearings included testimony and affidavits from witnesses totaling 1,145 pages. The British Court of Inquiry convened under Attorney General Lord Mersey. An attack was made during the course of the inquiries on the moral conduct of Titanic ship owner Mr. Bruce Ismay.
Mr. Ismay, for the purposes of simplifying these hearings, I'm going to ask you a few preliminary questions. First, state your full name.
Joseph Bruce Ismay.
Where do you reside?
Liverpool.
And your age?
I shall be 50 on the 12th of December.
And your occupation?
Ship owner.
You're an officer of the White Star Line.
I am.
In what capacity?
Managing director.
Mr. Ismay, what is your best recollection of that night?
We had just retired to our stateroom, and the noise of the collision was not at all alarming. We had just fallen asleep. Then, my wife awoke me.
Something had happened to the ship.
We went on deck, and everything seemed quiet and orderly.
The starboard side of the Titanic had struck the big iceberg, and ice was piled up on the deck. None of us had the slightest realization that the ship had received its death wound.
The orchestra was playing a lively tune. The crew began lowering the lifeboats after a lapse of some minutes. There was little excitement.
As the lifeboats were being lowered, many of the first cabin passengers expressed their preference of staying on the ship.
I saw Colonel Astor, Major Boat, and Captain Smith standing together about 11:30 o'clock. There was absolutely no excitement among them. Captain Smith said there was no danger.
The passengers were constantly being assured that there was no danger, but that as a matter of extra precaution, the women and children should be placed in the lifeboats.
Everything was quiet and orderly when I placed Mrs. Dodge and the boy in the 4th or 5th boat.
As I was put into the boat, he cried to me, "It's all right, you go. I will stay." As our boat shoved off, he threw me a kiss, and that was the last I saw of him.
I believe there were 20 boats lowered away altogether. I did what I could to help in keeping order, but as the 6th or 7th boat was launched, the excitement began.
Some of the passengers fought with such desperation to get into the lifeboats that officers shot them, and their bodies fell into the ocean.
I saw an officer of Titanic shoot down 2 steerage passengers who were endeavoring to rush the lifeboats. I've learned since that 12 of the steerage passengers were shot altogether.
We could hear the orchestra playing Lead Kindly Light, and rockets were going up from the Titanic in the wonderfully clear night. In the distance, we saw 2 lifeboats were being made ready to be lowered. You see, the panic, it was in the steerage. It was that portion of the ship that the shooting was made necessary.
It was 10:30 when the collision occurred, and 1:55 o'clock when the ship went down. I saw Major Archibald Butt stand with John Jacob Astor as the water rolled over the Titanic.
Mrs. Strauss showed admirable heroism. She refused with great determination to leave her husband, and although twice entreated to get into the lifeboats, she declined with great force while any other women were left.
The 13th boat was filled on one side with children, fully 20 or 30 of them, with few women. All in the boat were panic-stricken and screaming.
I will never forget the awful sight of the great steamer as they pulled away. From the upper rails, heroic husbands and fathers waving and blowing kisses to the children and women in those receding lifeboats.
Captain Smith stayed on the bridge practically until the very last. And then, after the ship sank, I saw him swimming in the water holding a small child in his arms that he vainly tried to save. And then, afterwards, he just disappeared.
The band started playing hymns. After his fellow musicians had been washed away, the violinist continued playing Near My God to Thee until he too was swept away.
The Titanic broke in two between the funnels. There were explosions. The machinery fell out of the hull when she split. The bow went down and the stern went straight up in the air before the final plunge.
A great many of the passengers and crew were killed by the falling of one of the funnels when the ship broke. Others, when she dipped, were killed by being thrown violently into the well of the forecastle.
I heard that nearly 400 men employed in the stokeholds refused to leave their posts. And not one of these men did until the order was given, every man for himself.
I saw the way she was carrying herself in the lifeboat, the quiet, determined manner in which she spoke. I knew she was more of a man than most on board, so I put her in command at the tiller. There was another woman who was every minute rowing. It was she who suggested we sing, so we sang. We started to pull for the shore, and we kept singing until we saw the lights of the Carpathia. Then we stopped singing and prayed.
It seemed to me that the panic began after the boats were gone. As we rowed away, we could hear the panic of the passengers on deck screaming and looking for lifeboats. I can only tell you I was terrified. It's impossible to use another word for it. I was absolutely terrified, as anyone would be. Oh, it was dreadful. The bow went down first, and the stern stuck up for what seemed like the longest time. It wasn't, of course, but it stuck out stark against the sky and then went down. We could hear the ghastly noise of the people screaming and thrashing about in the water, drowning. A noise that finally ceased. I remember telling my mother once about the dreadful noise, and I always remember her reply. She said, "Yes, but what about the silence that followed it?" Because all of a sudden, it wasn't there. The ship wasn't there, and the lights weren't there, and the cries weren't there.
The RMS Titanic started the White Star Line that Southampton for maiden voyage on Wednesday, April 10th, 1912.
The Titanic was known as the Ship of Dreams. First-class public rooms included writing rooms, reading rooms, dining saloons, reception rooms, veranda cafes, and a palm court. The grand central staircase was exactly that. It stood over 60 feet from the lower landing to the glass skyline above. And above the centerpiece fireplace was a painting by Norman Wilkinson entitled The Approach to the New World.
Those who required an after-dinner drink could find exactly what they wanted in the well-stocked bar. Others enjoyed walking around the room, looking at the painted glass windows depicting many different ports from around the world and other White Star Line ships. Before dinner, saloon passengers could gather and discuss the day's activities aboard the ship. Some would sit in one of the many floral-patterned grandfather chairs to be found there. The reception room led directly to the dining room.
Second-class accommodation would be found on 7 decks. There is access beginning by second-class grand stairway or an electric elevator that ran up and down all 7 decks. There were over 1,000 third-class passengers. Their accommodations were much more modest than the other two. The engine room staff were housed on the starboard side and front wards of the ship, on the lower, middle, upper, and saloon decks. 2 spiral staircases connected their rooms to the engines and boilers. The White Star Line intended that the crew and passengers shall never meet during any time of their voyage, or so I'm told. As the lost ship approached, the Titanic found itself to be the center of media attention. Such fanfare brought the wealthiest and most prominent of American and British society. Among those passengers were
John Jacob Astor, the wealthiest man on board. He was returning from his honeymoon with his 18-year-old bride. She was 5 months pregnant already, and they were returning to New York so that the child could be born in America.
Thank you. Benjamin Guggenheim was a Swiss immigrant, a trip his family made to the U.S. to make their fortune. He too was aboard the Titanic. Benjamin invested the family money into new smelting techniques, and it paid off handsomely, as his interests soon far outstripped the rest of his family. Benjamin was returning to New York and to his wife after an extended stay in Paris. Accompanied on board with him was his Parisian mistress.
Major Archibald Butt, military advisor to former President Taft.
Isidore Strauss was the co-founder of the Macy's department store chain. He was returning to New York with his wife, Ida.
Molly Brown was a nouveau riche American woman who had become famous for her tenacity and known throughout history as the unsinkable Molly Brown. Her husband had struck a rich in gold mining in Colorado. He was a social recluse, but Molly intended to become part of the social elite and once stated that she knew everyone worth knowing from Moscow to the Bosphorus. She was in Egypt with her friends the Astors when news reached her that her grandchild in Denver was gravely ill, and she was returning to attend to him.
The whole thing was so formal, it was difficult to realize it was a tragedy. The men and women stood around in small groups talking. Many laughed as the first lifeboats were put over the side. All the time, the band played. After a while, I began helping women into the lifeboat. I knew the last woman. She was French. She was very excited. I spoke to her in French and helped her into the boat. Somehow, I did not seem to care about the thing of being saved. We all thought the boat was so big she wouldn't go down for a day at any rate.
Colonel Archibald Gracie, an independently wealthy man from a prominent family, who, amongst whose accomplishments, is the building of Gracie Mansion, which became the residence of the mayor of New York City in 1942. Also rather prominent in military history of the United States, Brigadier General Gracie, Archibald's father, went south to fight for the Confederacy and lost his life in Chickamauga. Archie, a military man himself, being a colonel in the 7th Regiment, has just written a book about the Battle of Chickamauga. He is returning from Europe on holiday after the publishing of his book.
Thank you. I was driven on the topmost deck and was the sole survivor after the wave had swept. I jumped with the wave, as I often jump with breakers at the seashore. Luckily, by great good fortune, I managed to grasp the brass rails on the deck above and held on with might and main. Eventually, I was forced to let go and was swirled around and around for what seemed to be an interminable time. Eventually, I came to the surface to find the sea, nothing but a mass of tangled wreckage. Luckily, I was unhurt and cast off in seas. A wooden grate floated nearby. Once I caught my breath, I discovered a large canvas and cork wrap floating nearby. A man whose name I did not learn was struggling towards it from some sort of piece of wreckage he clung onto. And then I cast off and helped him into the boat, and we began our work. Those who jumped into the sea, floundering the water.
The Titanic displays 46,000 tons, the largest luxury liner of its very brief time. It was also one of the first ocean liners to come equipped with a new concept in ship design, the watertight bulkhead. The ship was divided into 16 watertight compartments from bow to stern, and no penetration for ventilation, cabling, machinery, or anything else was permitted to allow water to pass from one compartment to the next. Emergency access doors could be closed by remote from the bridge or by emergency float switches, thus sealing the barrier that would prevent no fire or flooding from passing from one part of the ship to the next. During the media frenzy, White Star Line and myself boasted that this feature, along with the ship's sheer size, rendered the Titanic unsinkable.
Please state your full name.
Mrs. Helen W. Bishop.
Bishop. Was there anything about the ship or any special feature that drew your attention while en route from Southampton to the place of this accident?
We thought nothing at all except the luxury of the ship. How wonderful it was!
The boat was so luxurious, so steady, so immense, and such a marvel that one could not believe he was on a boat. And there the danger lay. We had smooth seas, clear starlit nights, fresh favoring winds, nothing to mar our pleasure. On Saturday, as Mr. Douglas and I were walking forward, we saw seamen taking the temperature of the water.
My husband and I were walking along the promenade deck, which, as I recollect it, was the deck below the hurricane deck. And it was while we were walking along here that we first noticed the seamen taking the temperature as well.
The deck seemed so high above the sea, I was interested to know if the tiny pail could reach it. There was quite a breeze, and although the pail was weighted, it did not. This I watched from the open window of the covered deck. Drawing up the pail, the seaman filled it with water from the standpipe, placed the thermometer into it, and took it to the officer in charge.
My husband was a sailor all of his lifetime, and he told me all about it. It was from this that I knew what they were doing.
On Sunday, we had a delightful day. Everyone was in the best of spirits. The time the boat was making was considered very good, and all were interested in getting into New York early. We dined in the restaurant.
Mr. Ismay, as an officer of the White Star Line, were you officially designated to make the trial trip of the Titanic?
No.
You were a voluntary passenger.
A voluntary passenger, yes.
Will you kindly tell the committee the circumstances surrounding your voyage, and as succinctly as possible, beginning with you coming on the vessel at Liverpool, your place on the ship on the voyage, and any other circumstance that you feel would be helpful in this inquiry?
In the first place, I'd like to express my sincere grief at this deplorable
You
catastrophe.
describe the trial she went through.
I was not present. She arrived on Wednesday the 3rd and sailed on Wednesday the 10th. She left Southampton at 12 o'clock. She arrived at Cherbourg later that evening, having run over at 68 revolutions. We left Cherbourg and proceeded to Queenstown. We arrived there, I think, about midday on Thursday. We ran from Cherbourg to Queenstown at 70 revolutions. After embarking the mails and passengers, we proceeded at 70 revolutions. On the second day, the number of revolutions was increased. On the third day, the number of revolutions was increased to 75. The weather during this time was absolutely fine, with the exception, I think, of about 10 minutes fog one evening. The accident took place on Sunday night. I was in bed myself asleep when the accident happened. The ship sank, I am told, at 2:20. That, sir, I think is all that I can tell you.
Mr. Ismay, at what time did the Titanic leave Southampton?
Wednesday, April 10th, 1912, 12 p.m.
The Titanic cast off mooring lines at the pier at Southampton and was towed out to the river. As she approached the New York's mooring lines snapped and swung towards the Titanic. There was no collision, but the Titanic steamed out to sea
Wednesday,
at
5:30 to 8:30
1:30
p.m. Titanic arrived Cherbourg, France. She is forced to anchor outside of the harbor because there's no pier large enough to moor to. Tender ships ferry out
Thursday, April
passengers
11th at
and cargo.
1:30 p.m., the Titanic departed
On
from Queenstown Island
Saturday,
as the last
April
picture was taken.
13th, the Titanic's wireless telegraph
Sunday,
set
April
breaks
14th.
down during the
Titanic's
evening.
wireless telegraph system is repaired in the early morning. The operators are swamped with the number of passenger messages that have accumulated during
At
the
1
downtime
o'clock
that hurry to
p.m., an
catch up.
ice warning is received from the Coronia. Second Officer Lightoller
At
posted it in
1:40
the chart
p.m., an
room.
additional ice warning sheet from Baltic. This one is sent to Captain Smith, who passes the message to the White Stars Line's managing director, J. Bruce Ismay. Ismay pockets the message
At
and
6
does not mention the
p.m.,
bridge
Captain
until
Smith
later
orders
that
course
evening.
stay slightly south and west of
7:30
normal.
p.m. 3 ice warnings are received from the Californian and delivered to the bridge. The Californian is only 50 miles directly ahead of the Titanic at this point. The captain is not notified,
At
however,
9:20
he's
p.m.,
attending a
Captain
dinner
Smith pays
party.
a visit to the bridge and has a discussion with his officer of the deck, too. Second Officer Lightoller about poor visibility. His night orders are to proceed at
9:30
22.5
p.m. Ice warning is
knots.
received from the messabot, which reads, saw much heavy pack ice, a great number of large icebergs, also field ice. Quite clearly points out the magnitude of the hazard and places it squarely in the path of the
10
Titanic.
o'clock
This
p.m.
message never reached
Next
the
shift
bridge.
of watches take over. First
10:10
Officer
p.m.
Murdoch
Wireless
has
operator
the
Jack
bridge.
Phillips still trying to cope with the backlog of passenger messages to be transmitted as the following conversation with wireless operator Cyril Evans of the Californian.
Sail, man, we're stopped and surrounded by ice.
Shut up, shut up. I'm busy.
11:35 p.m. California wireless operator Cyril Evans turns off his set
11:40
and retires
p.m.
for the
Crow's
night.
Nest officer Frederick Fleet takes his position and spots an iceberg dead ahead. He telephones the bridge. First Officer Murdoch orders the engines full astern and the helm hard to port. The idea is to miss the berg by reversing engines and swinging to the left. A few moments later, a grating sound is heard across the starboard bow.
It may have been 30 feet high when I saw it. It was possibly 200 yards away and dead ahead. Captain Smith shouted some orders. A number of us promenaders rushed to the bow of the ship. When we could see he could no fail to hit it, we rushed to the stern. Then came a crash, and the passengers were panic-stricken.
I was on watch until 12 o'clock, and I was waiting for my relief to come up. I heard a crash. So, I went on the outer deck and saw an iceberg floating alongside. I looked about, and I remember there were a lot of passengers coming out.
Will you tell us what you did after learning of this accident?
My husband woke me at about 11:45 and told me that the boat had struck something. We both dressed and we went up on the deck. We looked around and could find nothing. We noticed the intense cold. In fact, we had noticed that at about 11 o'clock that night. It was uncomfortably cold in the lounge. Then we walked up and down a couple of times. One of the stewards met us and laughed at us.
You go back downstairs. There's nothing to be afraid of. We've only struck a little piece of ice, moved past it.
So we returned to our stateroom and retired. About 15 minutes later, we were awoken by an old man who had a stateroom near us. We were on B deck, number 47. He told us to get dressed and come upstairs. So we dressed again, thoroughly, looked over all the belongings in our room and went upstairs. About 5 or 10 minutes later, one of the men we were with ran up and spoke to the captain, who was just then coming down the stairs.
11:45 p.m. to 12 a.m. Inspections reveal the forward 5 watertight compartments have been compromised. Titanic Chief Design Engineer Thomas Andrews informs Captain Smith that the ship will founder in fewer than 90 minutes.
Mr. Ismay, describe what you did after learning of this impact or collision.
I presume the impact awakened me. I lay in bed for a moment or two afterwards, not realizing probably what had happened. Eventually, I got up. I walked along the passageway where I met one of the stewards and said, "What has happened?"
I do not know, sir.
I then went back to my room where I got my coat and went up on the bridge where I found Captain Smith. I asked him what had happened.
"We have struck ice."
"Do you think that the ship is seriously damaged?"
"I'm afraid she is."
I then went down below where I found Mr. Bell, the chief engineer, who was in the main companionway. I asked him if he thought the ship was seriously damaged.
I think she is, but I'm quite satisfied the pumps will keep her afloat.
Lightar, uncover the lifeboats. Load the women and children first. Have Jack Phillips and Harold Bride begin transmitting the following.
We have struck a berg. Require assistance.
Bring the women off in the boats first.
Closest ship to respond is the Carpathia. Approximately 4 hours away at best speed.
We were on B deck and we came back up to A deck. There was very little confusion. Only the older women were a little frightened. They were up, partially dressed, so I sent a number of them back to see that they were thoroughly dressed before they came up again. Then we went up on the boat deck on the starboard side. There were so very few people up there that my husband and I went to the port side to see if there was anyone there. Only 2 people, a young French bride and groom on that side of the boat. They followed us immediately to the starboard side. By that time, the old man had found Mr. and Mrs. Harder of New York. He brought us all together and told us be sure and stay together, that he would be back in a moment. We never saw him again. About 5 minutes later, our boat was lowered and we were pushed in.
The orchestra stationed themselves outside the first-class passenger entrance, hoping to soothe the passengers and forestall the panic.
A number of us who enjoyed the crisp air were promenading about the deck. Captain Smith was on the bridge when the first cry from the lookout came.
Iceberg ahead!
What is your full name?
Frederick Fleet.
And your business?
Sailor.
Look, Mr. Fleet, will you tell me who was in the forward part of the Titanic when you took your position in the crow's nest Sunday evening?
There was nobody.
Nobody?
No, sir.
Who was on the bridge?
When I went up to lead the others?
Yes.
Mr. Murdoch.
Did you keep a sharp lookout for ice?
I did.
Tell me what you did.
Well, I reported an iceberg right ahead, a black mass.
How long before the collision did you report ice ahead?
Well, I have no idea.
About how long?
I could not say at the rate she was going.
How fast was she going?
I have no idea.
Would you be willing to say that you reported ice ahead an hour before the collision?
No, sir.
45 minutes before?
No, sir.
A half hour before?
No, sir.
15 minutes before?
No, sir.
10 minutes before?
No, sir.
How far away was the black mass before you first saw it?
I have no idea, sir!
What is the purpose of sending 3 bells?
To
Captain knows an iceberg right ahead.
Denotes danger.
No, it just tells me on the prints that there's something about.
But you gave both precautions. You gave 3 bells and then went to telephone the bridge.
I did.
Where did you have to go to telephone?
The telephone's in the nest.
You turned and communicated in the nest. Did you get a prompt response?
I did.
Then what did you do?
I kept staying ahead again.
Do you know if the engines were stopped before after the telephone signal?
No. No, she did not stop. She didn't stop till she passed the iceberg.
Were the engines reversed?
Well, she started to go to port while I was at the telephone.
How do you know that?
My mate saw it, told me. He told me to see the bow coming around while I was at the telephone.
They swung the ship away from the object to avoid hitting it?
Yes, because we were making straight for it.
But you saw the course alter, and at what point did the iceberg strike the Titanic?
On the stern mountains below the foremast!
I think I went back on the bridge. I heard the order given to get the lifeboats out. I walked along to the starboard side of the ship where I met one of the officers, and I told him to get the boats out.
12:45 a.m. Boat 7 is the first boat in the water. Out of a capacity for 65 people, only 28 are on board.
12:55 a.m. As Boat 5 is being lowered in the water with room for 24 more, J. Bruce Ismay points out the fact that the boat isn't full to the officer in charge of lowering the boat, 5th Officer Lowe. Lowe verbally chastises Ismay for interfering with his command.
As I dressed, I heard the order shouted,
"All passengers on deck with lifebelts on!"
We all walked up slowly with the lifebelts tied on our clothing, but even then we presumed that this was merely a wise precaution the captain was taking. The ship was absolutely still except for the gentle, almost unnoticeable tilt downwards. There are no visible signs of the approaching disaster. But in a few moments, we saw the covers being lifted from the boats, and the crews allotted to them standing by and coiling the ropes. We then began to realize this was a more serious matter than we had first supposed. Presently, I heard the order,
"All men stand back away from the boats! All ladies retire to the next deck below!"
The men all stood away waiting in absolute silence, some leaning against the end railings of the deck, others pacing slowly up and down. The lifeboats were level with the deck where the women were collected. The women got in quietly, with the exception of some who refused to leave their husbands behind. In some cases, they were torn from their husbands and pushed into the lifeboats. But in many instances, they were allowed to remain since there was no one to insist that they should go.
Mrs. White, do you make the Waldorf Astoria your permanent residence?
My home is really Briarcliff Lodge, Briarcliff Manor, New York. However, when I am in New York, I am always here at the Waldorf Astoria.
Mrs. White, I'm only going to ask you a few questions, and I want you to answer in your own way. When did you leave your room?
I never left my room. I never left my room until the night of the collision. I was never on the other side of the door until that night.
Once you boarded the vessel, you went straight to your apartment and remained there.
I remained in my room until I left out that night. I never stepped foot away from my bed until that night.
Do you know if any alarm was turned in for the passengers?
We heard no alarm whatever. We took ourselves immediately to the deck.
You went on deck?
We went immediately to the deck ourselves.
On the upper deck?
Yes, sir.
Was anything being done about the lifeboats?
No, we were just standing around inside waiting to know what the outcome was.
The lifeboats weren't uncovered?
No, nothing was said about the lifeboats whatsoever. And then Captain Smith suddenly appeared on the staircase and came down and ordered us to immediately put on our life preservers, which we did. And then we had to stand around for another 20 minutes, I should think.
Did the captain remain on the bridge?
That I could not say.
Did you leave him on the bridge?
Yes, sir.
His first statement to you was that he felt she was severely damaged.
Yes, sir.
And the chief engineer's statement was what?
To the same effect.
Did you have occasion to consult the captain about the movement of the ship?
Never.
Did he consult you about it?
Never.
Did you of your own knowledge, know of your proximity to icebergs?
Sunday afternoon, Mr. Ismay, whom I know very slightly, passed me on the deck. He showed me in his brisk manner a Marconigram saying we just had news that we were in the icebergs. Oh, surely you'll slow down, I said. Oh no, he replied. We will put on more boilers and get out of it.
Did I know that we were near icebergs?
Yes.
No, I did not.
Did you yourself see any icebergs or any large volumes of ice?
No, not until after the accident.
Are you aware of the wireless message from the America to the Titanic?
No, sir.
Saying the America had found ice in that latitude?
No, sir.
Are you aware of your proximity to icebergs on Sunday?
Sunday afternoon, he showed me a Marconigram saying we just had news that we were in the icebergs.
On Sunday? No, I did not know on Sunday. I knew that ice had been reported, and I knew we would be in that region on Sunday night.
Would be or were?
That we would be in the region on Sunday night.
Did you have occasion to consult the captain on that matter?
Absolutely not.
You are Mr. Charles Herbert Lightoller.
Yes,
Were you second officer on the Titanic?
I was.
Do you remember Captain Smith showing you a wire?
Yes.
Just tell us what it was.
The captain came on the bridge when I was relieving Mr. Murdoch. He had a wireless message, a Marconigram. He came across the bridge and held it out and told me to read it.
He showed it to you, I suppose?
Yes, he held it in his hands and told me to read it. The exact wording of the message I cannot recall.
Did you see whether it was about ice?
It had reference to ice.
Well, we have the message. I will find it and read it to you. Perhaps you will be able to tell me if it's right. Independent evidence. From the Coronia. Westbound steamers report bergs, growlers, field ice in 42 north from 49 to 51 west.
Yes, that is the wireless message as best as I can recall.
So, as far as your knowledge goes, is that the first information to ice which you have heard being received by the Titanic?
That's the first I have recollection of.
Add anything, if there's anything else we ought to know. Is that the incident as it occurred then?
That is the whole of the incident when the commander came on the bridge and showed me the wireless. Yes.
At the time this message was given to you by Captain Smith, how many hours steaming would you be away from the ice field?
I did not calculate it at the time. Later, I had one of the junior officers figure when we'd be in the ice region, and he said 11 o'clock.
At night?
Oh, I was sure of that.
Then who would be on the bridge? Is it one or two of the junior officers would be on the bridge with you?
2 junior officers at all time.
There would be a quartermaster at the wheel.
And a standby quartermaster.
There would be 2 lookout men in the crow's nest.
At all times.
What was the practice on Titanic, as far as this voyage is concerned, about having a lookout man anywhere else?
Well, anything but clear weather, we hold extra lookouts.
Where do you put them?
Well, if the weather is good, that is, the sea allows, we put them in the stem head. If the weather does not allow us to put them in the stem head, then on the bridge.
As far as your watch was concerned, 6 to 10 on the evening of April 14th, were there any other lookouts except for the 2 men in the crow's nest?
No.
What was the weather?
Perfectly clear and fine.
Mr. Ismay, are you aware of the wireless workings of the ship?
In what way? We had wireless on the ship.
Did the wireless continue to operate after the collision?
I do not know.
What is your full name?
Harold Sidney Bride.
Where do you reside?
London.
What is your age?
22.
And your occupation?
Wireless telegraph operator.
Were you on duty when the wireless message was received from the America regarding ice in that longitude?
I have no knowledge of any wireless message received from the America regarding any iceberg.
You did not receive one from the America?
No, sir.
Are you very certain of that?
Yes, sir.
Are you also very certain that the only message regarding ice was from the Californian?
Yes, sir.
Were you in bed when the impact occurred?
Yes, sir.
Were you asleep?
Yes, sir.
Were you wakened by it?
No, sir.
How were you wakened?
I woke up of my own accord.
No one came aroused you after the impact?
No, sir.
Did you at any time see the operator of the wireless?
I did not.
Did you send any messages yourself?
I did not.
Were you on deck, or any other deck, when the order was given to lower the lifeboats?
I heard the captain give the order when I was on the bridge.
Tell us what he said.
I know I heard him say, lower the boats. I think that's all he said. I think he simply turned around and gave the order.
Did you see any boats lowered yourself?
Yes, sir. 3.
Tell us, if you can, how they were lowered.
They were swung out. The people were put in from the deck, and then they were simply lowered away down to the water.
I was the secretary to the chef on Titanic. We had been by the third-class deck and told the rest of the cooks to wait for us. Downstairs, we tried to go to the second-class passenger deck. They would not let us pass. I was in my regular clothes like the chef. I said, I am the secretary to the chef. They said, pass it off. Get away. The third-class deck crew could not come up. They would not let them pass. That is where they died. After that, we were lowered from the boat, and I told the chef to jump down to me. He could not. He was too fat, too big, I must say. He said something, but I could not hear it, because at the same time, a man said to me, shut up, or something like that. And then from Titanic, tried to grab me and take my seat. It happened just like that. I never saw the chef again.
Were these boats on various decks?
They were all on one deck.
They were all on the boat deck, which is the upper deck of all.
The upper deck of all, yes.
Was there any order or supervision by the officers of the ship in the loading and lowering of these lifeboats?
Yes, sir. The boats that were lowered where I was were in the charge of the officer, and they were filled and lowered away.
You first put men in these boats for the purpose of controlling them?
We put in some of the ship's people.
Some of the ship's people?
Yes.
Was Mr. Lowe one of these people?
I ran away from home when I was about 14, and I joined a schooner. All things considering, I was in 7 schooners altogether. See, my father, he wanted to apprentice me, but I told him I would not be apprenticed. I'm not going to work for anyone for nothing. I want to be paid for my labor. That was previous to my running away. My father took me to Liverpool, to a lot of officers there. It was there that I told him once again, I will not be apprenticed, and that settles it. So of course I ran away, and I joined these schooners. From schooners I went to Square Rig sailing ships. From Square Rig sailing ships I went to steam, and I gathered all of my proper certificates. For 5 years I was on the West African coast in the service there. And then from there, I joined the White Star Line.
How many of the ship's people?
That I could not say.
About how many?
I could not say.
You saw 3 lifeboats lowered yourself.
Yes.
As they were being loaded, was there any order on how they should be loaded?
No.
How was it that women were first put in these lifeboats?
The natural order would be women and children first.
Was that the order?
Oh, yes.
That was followed?
As far as practicable.
As far as you observed!
So far as I observed.
Not a soul on board knew the Titanic had been wet and strained off the 1/3 of its length on the starboard side. Neither did a soul on board know that at that very moment, water was pouring through the rent plates and the ship was slowly on its way to the bottom. I was one of those sent to release the boats from the davits, and upon reaching the outer deck, I found that a long, orderly line of passengers. They were being filed into the boats 4 at a time. 3 women and 1 man.
Boat 1 is lowered with 12 aboard at a maximum capacity of 40 persons, with Sir Cosmo and Lady Duff Gordon aboard, and 7 crew. At the same time on the port side, Boat H is lowered with 39 aboard at a maximum capacity of 65. It is steered in the water by the Countess of Rothus.
In a secluded corner of the deck, I made out the forms of Colonel John Astor and his wife. I called to them, come over and get into one of the boats. They hugged each other in a final embrace, and then they approached me. Miss Astor took a seat in one of the boats. The Colonel, he hesitated for a moment.
Mrs. Astor was put in the boat. She was lifted up through the window, and her husband helped her onto the side. She got in, her husband was on one side of the boat, and I was on the other, at the next window. I heard Mr. Astor ask the second officer whether he or not be allowed to accompany his wife on his boat.
He was refused by Lightoller.
He said, "No, sir. No man's allowed on this boat, or any of the boats, until all the leave is off." Mr. Astor then asked,
At least tell me what number the boat is so I may find her afterwards.
When Colonel Astor had assisted his tearful young wife and her maid into a lifeboat, he tried to put in a young boy as well. But the sailors refused to let him in, saying that the room was only for the children then. So Colonel Astor picked up a woman's hat from the dock and placed it on the boy's head and brought him back to the boat. He said,
Here, little girl, climb in.
and the officers of the ship let the boy through.
You then walked down to the rail to look at the near waterline. I saw him a little while later standing with Mr. Whiteman and son Harry at the rail. They were all aiding and giving words of praise and cheer to the heartbroken women whose sobs and pleadings rose over the noise of the screeching davits as the boats were being lowered.
As the boat was lowered away, Colonel Astor stood on the deck, waving goodbye.
The boat is lowered into the water with room for 25 more.
During all this time, the ship had been sailing so slowly, now it was noticed that it had begun to sink faster. Those of us who remained on board were left to die.
realizing there's very little hope to getting the men off, Benjamin Guggenheim and his men, sir, emerged from their cabins, dressed in their finest suits, locked up to start.
We've dressed up in our best and prepared to go down like gentlemen.
His last officer was White from New York. He composed his letter, gives it to another man, who survives, sees the letter delivered. This was the brief message.
If anything should happen to me, tell my wife in New York I've done the best in doing my duty. So I said. There wasn't time for more. Mr. Guggenheim was one of my charges. He had his secretary with him. His name was Giglio, I believe, an Armenian, about 24 years old. Both died like soldiers. When the crash came, I awakened them, told them to get dressed. A few minutes later, I went into their rooms and helped them get ready. I put a life preserve on Mr. Guggenheim. He said it hurt him in the back, but there was plenty of time. Took it off, adjusted it, put it on him again. And it was all right this time. They wanted to go out on the deck with only a few clothes on, but I put a heavy sweater over Mr. Guggenheim's life belt and they both went out. They stayed together and I could see what they were doing. They were going from one lifeboat to another, helping the women and children. Mr. Guggenheim would shout out, "Women first!" And he was of great assistance to the officers. Things weren't so bad at first. But when I saw Mr. Guggenheim about 3/4 of an hour after the crash, there was great excitement. It was then he told me about the message to his wife. Well, shortly before the last few lifeboats were lowered away, I was ordered by a deck officer to man an oar. Wave goodbye to Mr. Guggenheim. That was the last I saw of him, and his Armenian secretary.
Ida Strauss, wife of Isidore Strauss, refused to get into a boat after learning that her husband would be unable to accompany her to safety. Mr. Strauss was offered a seat on the boat, but he declined, citing that no other men were boarding and it would be improper for him to do so.
Did you know Mr. and Mrs. Strauss?
I stood at the boat when they refused to get in.
Did Mrs. Strauss get into the boat?
She attempted to, and then she got back. Her maid got into a boat.
What do you mean she attempted to get in?
She went to go get into a boat, and then she went back to her husband.
Did Mrs. Strauss step on the boat?
She stepped on the boat, on the gunwale, sir, and then she went back.
What followed?
She said,
"We have lived together so many years. There you go, I go."
To whom did she speak?
To her husband.
Was he beside her?
He was standing a ways back when she went from the boat.
You said there was a maid.
Maid got on board and was saved, yes.
Did the maid precede Mrs. Strauss?
Miss Strauss told the maid to...
"Get in the boat, I will follow you."
And then she went back to her husband.
We did not talk very much. Just a little ways from us, I saw there was an old couple standing there on the deck. I heard this man say to the lady,
"Get into the lifeboat and get saved!"
He put his hand on her shoulder and I think he said,
"Please, get into the lifeboat and get saved!"
No, let me stay with you. So we live together. We will die together.
The parting of the last two boats from the starboard side caused all those on board to rush the wreck. Here I found Mr. and Mrs. Isidore Strauss, the arms and folds of one another. Miss Strauss refused to get into a lifeboat after learning that her husband would be unable to accompany her to safety.
Mrs. Strauss went to her death because she would not desert her husband. He pleaded with her to get into the boat, but she steadfastly refused. When the ship set up ahead, the two were engulfed by the wave that swept her.
They went down to their death in the sea, locked in each other's arms.
Fourth Officer Boxhall spots a mast headlight just off the port bow. He immediately attempts to communicate via Morse slant, and Quartermaster Rowe begins firing off distress flares.
Captain Smith orders boat 10 to row toward the ship quite visible off the port bow, drop off its passengers, and return for more.
At 2:05 a.m., J. Bruce Ismay stepped aboard collapsible C, the next to last collapsible to be lowered. In an effort to fend off the panicked passengers, Lightoller waved his pistol in the air, and the crew locked arms around the ship, allowing only women and children to pass through.
I'd gone to an upper deck and was looking down on the picture. I could see the passengers stepping from the deck into the lifeboat into which I had just put the Frenchwoman. Then they swung the boat out over the water. I had noticed two men following me as I went from place to place talking with the women here and there. Suddenly they picked me up, carried me back down, and practically threw me into the boat with the words, "You're going too." They were Edward P. Calderhead and James Mago, two American merchants. I owe my life to them as there were no more boats, and I would now be with the others at the bottom. We were lowered to the water as gently as if it were a boat drill. Our boat could have carried several more. I can still see the men on that upper deck, tucking in the women and smiling and bowing. "After you," they would say, after making some woman comfortable and stepping back. It was a strange sight. It seemed like a play, like a drama being reenacted for entertainment. It did not seem real. Afterward, I heard the men went downstairs to the restaurant. Many of them smoked. Many just walked up and down.
Were all the women and children accommodated in these lifeboats?
I could not answer that.
One of the last women seen was Miss Evans of New York, who virtually refused to be rescued because, according to an eyewitness, she had been told by a fortune teller in London that she would meet her death on the water.
How many passengers were in the boat that you got away from the shipping?
I should think about 45.
Was that full capacity?
Practically.
How were the women designated when they were put in these lifeboats?
We simply picked the women out and put them in the boats as fast as we could.
Were the children shown the same consideration?
Absolutely.
When the Titanic struck the iceberg, I was in bed. A steward knocked on the stateroom door, directed us to get dressed, put on life preservers, and go to the boat deck. The steward was trying to arouse passengers who had locked themselves in for the night. Elevators were not running. We went up to the boat deck to an officer who was in charge.
"Women and children first,"
he said, as he directed lifeboat number 11 to be filled. There were many tearful farewells. We and Uncle Jim said goodbye.
How long did it take to lower and load a lifeboat?
That I could not say.
The lowering of the lifeboat 70 feet to the sea was perilous. Davits, ropes, nothing worked properly. So that first, one end of the lifeboat was tilted up, and then far down. I think it was the only time I was ever scared. Lifeboats pulled some distance away from the sinking Titanic, afraid of what suction might do. As row by row of the porthole lights of the Titanic sank into the sea, this is all about one could see. When the Titanic upended to sink, all was blacked out until the tons of machinery crashed to the bow. And as this happened, hundreds and hundreds of people were thrown into the sea. It isn't likely I shall forget the screams of these people as they perished in the water said to be 28 degrees. At that point in my life, I was being brought up as a typical British kid. You weren't allowed to cry. You were a little man. So as a cool kid, I just laid down at the bottom of the lifeboat and I went to sleep.
Mr. Ismay, what were the circumstances surrounding your departure from the ship?
The boat was there. There was a number of men already in the boat, and the officer called out asking if there were any more women, and there was no answer. And there were no passengers left on the deck.
Well, I can see a solid row of men from boat to stern crawl over onto the deck. We women then got in. I asked Mr. Douglas to come with me.
No, I must be a gentleman.
Try and get up with Mr. Moore and Major Budd. They were sure to make it.
The White House is not a cheerful place today. For President Taft, most of his cabinet, and many callers are concerned over the probable fate of Major A.W. Butt, who has been Mr. Taft's military aide since he first entered the White House. White Star Line officers in New York are keeping the President advised as they check over the list of names of rescued. As the chance of the Major's name appearing among the list grew fainter and fainter, they began to give up hope. The chance is a slim one, but we're holding on to that, the President said as he left for luncheon. Friends of the Major believe he'll be among the last to leave the ship.
I remember seeing Mr. Ryerson's face in the crowd. There were many people about. I got into the boat and I sat under the seats just below the tiller. Mr. Boxall had difficulty about getting the boat loose, so he called for a knife. And we finally were launched. I never saw Mr. Douglas again.
My boy Jack was with me. An officer at the window said, "That boy can't go." So my husband stepped forward and said,
Of course that boy goes with his mother. He's only 13.
so they let him pass. They also said, "No more boys." So I turned and kissed my husband. And as we left, he and the other men I knew, Mr. Thayer, Mr. Widener, and others, were all standing there together, very quietly.
There are no other passengers on deck.
No, sir. And as the boat was in the act of being lowered away, I got into it.
And at that point, was the Titanic sinking?
She was sinking.
I was standing there and I asked my brother-in-law if he could swim and he said no. I asked my cousin if he could swim and he said no. So we could see the water coming up. The bow of the ship was going down and there seemed to be a kind of an explosion. We could hear the popping and the cracking and the deck raised up and got so steep that the people could not stand on their feet on the deck. So they fell down and slid on the deck into the water right on the ship. Then I hung onto a rope and one of the davits. We were pretty far back at the top deck. My brother-in-law said to me, "We had better jump off or the suction will take us down." And I said, "No, we won't jump yet. We ain't got much to show in hell, so we might as well stay as long as we can." So he stated again, "We must jump off." I said, "No, not yet." So then it was only about 5 feet down to the water and we jumped off. It was not much of a jump. Before that, we could see the people were jumping over. The water was coming onto the deck, and they were jumping, then out into the water. My brother-in-law took my hand just as we jumped off.
A stewardess who had been saved told me that after the Titanic left Southampton, there were a number of carpenters working to put the doors of the airtight compartments in working order. They had great difficulty in making them respond, and one of them remarked that they would be of little use in case of accident because it took so long to make them work.
You were serving as first-class stewardess on the Titanic on the occasion of this disaster.
Yes.
Would it be your business to look after some of the ladies in your part of the ship?
Oh, certainly.
And did you go to look after them?
They had already gone out to their rooms.
Where did you go?
Up to B deck.
You went to B deck. Did you see any of your stewardesses about?
Yes, quite a number.
Were the stewardesses, as far as you could see, all doing their duty?
Yes, they had blankets and side downs put round people.
Did you remain on B deck, or did you go elsewhere?
I went down to the cabin again.
To your cabin?
Yes.
You went to your own cabin, and later on, did you go up?
Yes.
To which deck?
To A deck.
You were ultimately taken on to number 16 boat.
Yes.
And you were ultimately taken on board the Carpathia.
Yes.
Have you been for a considerable time a stewardess?
Yes.
Is it the practice on ocean liners to give each stewardess a boat station?
Yes.
And at some time on the voyage, are the stewardesses as well as the other hands called to their stations?
Only on sailing day.
But you are not that on the Titanic.
On the sailing day, we're all mustered in a companion to pass the doctor.
You mean the day you left Southampton?
Yes.
But were you told then what your boat station was?
No, we were supposed to look for it ourselves on the list.
After the collision, you and all the other stewardesses were doing their duty in helping the people as much as possible?
Yes.
Do you know if any general alarm was sounded on the Titanic?
I do not know.
Before your boat put off, did you hear the question asked whether there were any more women and children?
Yes. There were no more to be seen after we went off.
Did you see any of the men passengers with life preservers on?
Nearly all passengers had life preservers on.
You say there was no passengers in that part of the ship when you left the boat?
None.
Was there any apparent struggle amongst the men to board these lifeboats?
No, sir.
For a while after we reached the water, we watched the ship. We could hear the band playing. Every light was shining. A man in the back of our boat, a quartermaster they told us he was, said that we must row away from the big steamer. I was cold. I took off my life belt because I knew how cold the water was, and I felt that if I were to be drowned, I wanted it to happen quickly. They say it takes but 2 minutes. I did not want to linger. I figured it out and grabbed an oar. By rowing, I managed to stay warm. We were dropped to the water at midnight, perhaps a minute or so after.
Lady Duckgould, you will remember on the night of this disaster to Titanic, you were waiting by the collision, I think.
I was.
I want you to tell me one thing before we get to the boat. Has there been offers to you to go into any of the lifeboats?
Oh, yes. They came and tried to drag me away.
You mean some of the sailors?
The sailors. I was holding on to my husband's arm. They were very anxious that I should go.
And you refused to go?
Absolutely.
Well, eventually you did go with your husband in what is known as one of the emergency boats.
Yes, I did.
Just tell us quite shortly, I do not want to go into detail, but quite shortly, how it was you got into that boat. Do you remember?
Oh, quite well.
Well, would you tell, my lord?
After 3 boats had gone down, my husband, Miss Franks, and myself were left standing on the deck. There were no other people on the deck at all visible, and I had quite made up my mind that I was going to be drowned. And then, suddenly, there was this little boat in front of us, and some sailors, and an officer apparently giving them orders. And I said to my husband, ought we not to be doing something? And he said,
oh, we must wait for orders.
And then we stood there for quite some time while these men were fixing up things. And then my husband stepped forward and said,
Might we enter this boat? And the officer said the most polite way possible. Oh, certainly do. I will be most pleased.
And then someone hitched me up from the deck and pitched me into the boat. And then I believe Miss Franks was pitched in. It was not a case of getting in at all. We could not have got in. It was quite high. Well, after we'd been in a while, the boat was started to be lowered, and one American gentleman was pitched in while the boat was being lowered.
As your lifeboat was lowered past other decks, was there any time to take on other passengers?
No, sir. There were no passengers there to take on.
Did you, at any time, see any passengers jump into the sea?
I did not.
I was in the whale deck, on the bow, calling the watch that was relieving the first of the ice came aboard. You see, the collision, it burst open seams below the waterline, but did not even scratch the paint above the line. I know this because I was one of those who made an examination of the edge with a lantern. At 12:40 a.m., I went down into the engine room. We were making coffee, so there's not much thought of danger. I worked at the light engines for about 1 hour. It was at that time that I heard our chief engineer tell us that the number 6 bulkhead had given away. It was at that time that things began to look bad. I was told to go up on deck, so I made my way up a dummy funnel. When I got to deck, I saw that all of the lifeboats had left us, yet all of us in the engine room were at our post. I was near the captain and I heard him say,
"Well, boys, it's every man for himself now."
After the last lifeboat had left the deck, everyone gathered on the top deck. As I bent over, throwing a lifeboat around my shoulders, I heard a terrible cry go up from those left on the ship. I turned around, and I saw the stem of the ship disappearing under the waves. The stern then rose to an almost perpendicular position, and I, along with hundreds of others, were thrown into icy water below. Then one of those unaccountable acts of providence helped me. I was able to be saved. One of the boilers, which I suppose still had fires under it, exploded. This created a large wave which I rode until I was within reaching distance of some wreckage. I got to it. I just clung desperately.
The forward smokestack breaks loose and falls, crushing several people, including, it is suspected, John Astor.
Beside collapsible A, an officer is seen to shoot 2 over-anxious passengers. He says a quiet goodbye and shoots himself. Scuttlebutt has listed survivors, names of his first officer Murdoch.
As the bridge submerged, collapsible A, still being boarded, washed off the deck and capsized. In the frenzy to get it into the water, collapsible B was pushed off the roof of the officers' quarters, fell overturned onto the deck, and washed away empty.
The ship, pulled down at the bow by the weight of the water now inhabiting it, begins to submerge at the bow. The bow drifts slowly away from the stern, lifting it up out of the water. The stern is not slammed down right away, but stands on end for several seconds before falling fast and hard to the ocean floor.
2:20 a.m.
Titanic submerges. Not seem long before a great sweep of water went over us all. A great wave rose once and fell, and we knew the steamer was gone. There may have been many swimming, but we had rowed at least 1.5 miles by the time the steamer went down, and I saw none of it. We were in a boat, we were safe, and we were at work. I was simply fascinated. In a few minutes, a man in the back of the boat began to complain that we had no chance. We stood him patiently for quite some time, but after he complained repeatedly that we had no chance, and after he explained that we had no food, no water, and no compass, I told him to be still or he would go overboard. Then he was quiet. I rowed. Because I would have frozen to death had I not. I made them all row and saved their lives. Soon after the steamer went down, we began to hear other boats. In the haze, on a sea as calm as glass, we talked with 2 other boats which were near us. All of us, 16 boats in all, waved back and forth in the growing dawn. A man in the back of the boat, strange man, he seemed to be a foreigner. He never once moved his hands. I wondered why he did not freeze to death. He wore kid gloves and a monocle that he never once let drop from his eye. We picked up one man. I put some of our clothes around him and put him to work rowing.
At the time our lifeboat was lowered, I had no idea it was time to get off. We had been rowing for some distance when the other people were transferred into our boat. Then we rowed still farther away as the women were nervous about the suction. We waited out in the water perhaps 3/4 of an hour after we had rowed this distance. That's when we saw the Titanic sink. For some time, we were separated from all of the boats except one. That tied to us and stayed with us. We found we had no compass, no light.
Titanic had disappeared. And I must have become unconscious. For the next thing I knew, I'd been picked up by a lifeboat.
Approximately 30 people scrambled aboard Collapsible B, including Second Officer Lightoller, Wireless Operator Harold Bride, and Colonel Archibald Gracie.
Did you witness any circumstances around the conduct of the crew or their discipline that you would care to speak of?
Lots about them. The oarsmen who were with us. Oarsmen. I dare not call them oarsmen. I think they were dining room stewards. Well, before we cut loose from the ship, the 2 of them took out cigarettes and lighted them on an occasion like that. All those men escaped under the pretense of being oarsmen. The man who rowed me out took his oar and rowed all over the boat in every direction. I said to him, "Why don't you put your oar in the oarlock?" And he said, "Does it go in that hole?" And I said, "Certainly." He said, "I have never had an oar in my hand before." I spoke to the other man, and he said, "I've never had an oar in my hand before, but I think I can row." Those were the kind of men that we were put out to sea with that night. All those magnificent fellows that were left on board who would have been such a protection for us. Those were the kind of men with whom we were put out to sea with that night.
Did you see any passengers or crew with life-preserving apparatus on in the sea?
No, sir.
Mr. Ismay, what can you say about the disappearance and sinking of the Titanic? Can you tell me the manner in which she went down?
I did not see her go down.
You did not see her go down?
No.
When our boat had rowed about half a mile from the vessel, the spectacle was quite fairy-like. The Titanic, which was fully illuminated, was stationary, like some fantastic piece of stage scenery. The night was clear and the sea smooth, but it was intensely cold. Presently, the gigantic ship began to sink by the bows, and then those that had remained on board realized the horror of their situation. Suddenly, the lights went out, and an immense clamor filled the air, and one supreme cry for help. Little by little, the Titanic settled down.
How far were you away from the ship?
I do not know how far we were away. I was sitting with my back to the ship. We were rowing all the time we were in the boat. We were pulling away.
You were rowing?
Yes! I did not wish to see her go down.
You did not care to see her go down!
No. I'm glad I did not.
When you last saw her, was there any indication that she had broken in two?
No, sir.
When did you last see her?
I really could not say. It might have been 10 minutes after we left her. It's impossible for me to give any judgment at the time. I could not do it.
Was there any apparent confusion when you last saw her?
I did not look to see, sir. My back was turned to her. I only looked around once to see a red light, or green light, rather.
The last time you saw the captain was when you left him on the bridge?
Yes.
Did you have any message from him?
Nothing.
Do you know if she was equipped with her full complement of lifeboats?
She had not been. She could not have sailed. She would not have received her passenger certificate. Therefore, she must have been fully equipped.
There were no lights in the lifeboats. They didn't even know the plug was in the bottom of the boat to prevent it from sinking. There were no lights, no provisions, no lanterns, nothing at all in the boat but the oars.
Mr. Ismay, there's been some suggestion by passengers who got away in lifeboats that there was an explosion after the collision. Do you have any knowledge of that matter?
Absolutely not.
I heard the cries of the people as the boat went down and heard repeated explosions as though the boilers had exploded. Then we knew the boat had gone down, but there were no lights, and the cries and the explosions were terrible.
Did you hear any explosion or any evidence of explosions?
I was able to be saved because of an explosion.
After sinking with the ship, it appeared to me about to be propelled by some great force from the water. This might have been occasioned by a few explosions under the water. And I remember fearful stories of people being boiled to death.
We saw the ship was sinking rapidly. I was in the bow of the boat with my daughter and turned to see the great ship take a plunge towards the bow. The two forward funnels seemed to lean, and then she seemed to break in half, as if cut with the knife. As the bow went under, the lights went out. The stern stood up for several minutes, black against the stars. And then that, too, plunged down. And there seemed to be no sound for what seemed like hours. And then began the cries for help from the people who were drowning all around us, which seemed to go on forever.
Again and again, I prayed for deliverance, although I felt sure the end had come. I had the greatest difficulty in holding my breath because I knew that once I inhaled, the water would suffocate me. Once I got underwater, I struggled with all my strength to the surface. I got to air after a time, which seemed to be unending. There was nothing in sight, save for the ocean, strewn with large masses of wreckage.
Someone called out, "Pull for your lives or you'll be sucked under." And everyone that could rowed like mad. I could see my daughter, Mrs. Thayer, and Mrs. Astor all rowing.
Dying men and women were all about me, crying and groaning piteously. From swimming from one piece of wreckage to another, I finally reached the core craft. As soon as she became so filled and more came aboard her, she would seem to sink. The crew for self-preservation had therefore refused any others to come aboard her. This was the most sick and horrible scene of all.
We turned to pick up some of those in the water. Some of the women protested, but others persisted, and we dragged in 6 or 7 men. The men we rescued were principally stokers, stewards, and sailors, and were so chilled and frozen already they could hardly move. 2 of them died in the stern later, and many were raving and moaning and delirious most of the time.
The piteous cries of those still ring in my ears, and I will remember them to my dying day. Hold on to your hand, old boy! We shot these men trying to get aboard her. What more you'll sink us all? Many of those we refused answered back to us. Good luck. God bless you.
There was one man from New Jersey that I came in company with from London. I do not know what his name was. I tried to keep this man alive, but I could not make it. It was just at the break of day, and he was lying down. He seemed to be unconscious. He wasn't really dead. So I took him by the shoulders. I raised him up so that he was sitting up on this deck. He was just sitting down on the deck. I said to him, "We can see a ship now, brace up." And I took one of his hands. I raised it up like that. I took him by the shoulders and I shook him. He said, "Who are you?" He said, "Let me be. Who are you?" And I held him up like that for a little while, but I got tired and cold. And I found a little piece of a small board, a lot of which were floating around there, laid it under his head, on the edge of the boat to keep his head from the water. But it was no more than about half an hour or so when he died.
We had no lights or compass. There were several babies on the boat, but we had no milk or water.
Will you please describe as best as you can what happened after your boat got away from the Titanic?
We simply rowed away. We sat there for a long time. And then we saw the ship go down distinctly.
What was your impression of her as she went down?
It was something dreadful. Nobody ever expected the ship to go down. Not one person that night. Not one man aboard that ship ever expected it to go down. They all talk about the bravery of the men. There were no particular acts of bravery because none of them ever expected the ship to go down. If they ever expected the ship to go down, they wouldn't have frivoled about it as they did. You won't be allowed on without a pass when you come back, some said. And you won't be allowed on board tomorrow morning without a pass. They never would have said those things if they felt that the ship was going to sink. In my opinion, when the ship went down, it broke in two. It quite probably broke in two. I heard 4 distinct explosions. We thought that that was the boilers, but we didn't know anything about such things.
Did you urge the man in charge of your lifeboat to go back?
We did what we were ordered to do.
Did you urge him to go back to seek to pick up more people?
We did what we were ordered to do.
After she went down, the cries were horrible.
You did not hear it.
No.
As far as you knew, they were only to row about 200 yards.
Yes.
And did the men commence doing that?
At once.
Was there any conversation at all on the boat before Titanic sank?
No.
Do you understand the question I was putting to you?
No, I did not hear it in our little boat.
I have proof here before me. That is why I was not sure you understood the question.
I have no recollection.
Let me ask you again. I am speaking to you of before the Titanic sank. You understand?
Yes.
What I am asking you is before she sank, did you hear the men saying anything in the boat?
No.
Did you hear anything said about suction?
Well, perhaps I may have heard it, but I was awfully sick, and I do not think I could swear to it.
What?
I was awfully sick. I do not think I could swear to it.
I am asking you about something which I only know from your statement to your solicitor. Did you not hear a voice say, "Let us get away"?
Yes, I think so.
Did you hear it said, "It is such an enormous boat, none of us know what the suction may be if she is a goner"?
Yes, I heard them speaking of the enormous boat. It was the word suction I was not sure of. I see what you mean.
It is not what I mean, Lady Duff Gordon. It is what you are said to have said to your solicitor.
Well, I may have said so.
Such an enormous boat! That's referring to the Titanic!
Yes.
None of us know what the suction may be if she is a goner.
That was, I am sure, long before Titanic sank.
It was before the Titanic sank.
Yes, it was before.
Now, after the Titanic sank, you continue to be seasick. I understand.
Yes, terribly.
I only want to ask you one thing about that. Tell me, first of all, do you recollect very well what happened when you were in the boat?
No.
Your mind's a bit hazy about it?
Very.
I suppose there can be some conversation which you would not recollect, I suppose.
But I do not know.
I will put it to you definitely what was said with reference to yourself. Before the Titanic sank, did you hear the cries of people who were drowning?
No! After the Titanic sank, I never heard cries.
You never heard anything?
No, not after the Titanic sank.
Did not you hear cries at all?
Yes! Before she sank. Terrible cries.
Did you see her sink?
I did.
You mean to say, after that, you heard nothing at all?
My impression was that there was absolute silence.
The cries continued to come over the water. Some of the women implored Officer Lowe of number 14 to divide his passengers and go back to rescue. His first answer to those requests was,
You ought to be damn glad you're here and have got your own life.
after some time, he was persuaded to do as he was asked. As I came to him to be transferred into the other boat, he said to me,
Jump.
God damn you, jump! I showed no hesitancy. I've been waiting only my turn. It's so blasphemous during the 2 hours that we were in his boat. The women at my end of the boat all thought he was under the influence of liquor.
There's one question. Have you seen the London Daily News? What purports to be an article, especially written by your Southern America? I should like you to answer the following questions. Is it true that you said that there were women, children, and some men climb into a lifeboat and did an officer say, Lady Gordon, are you ready? Is it true that you said it was the captain's special boat? Is it true that you said you were slung up, cruised around for 2 hours, and did not seem very cold? Is it true that you said we watched her? We were 200 yards away, go down slowly, almost peacefully. How about this? An awful silence seemed to hang over everything. And from the waters had been the Titanic. Had been a rose, a bedlam of shrieks and cries. And it was at least an hour before the awful silence, gradually dying into a moan of despair. How about this? I remember the very last cry. It was a man's voice calling loudly, my God, my God. He cried monotonously in a dull, hopeless way. And we waited gloomily in the boats through the rest of the night. The stokers rowing as hard as they could to keep themselves warm. Is this all untrue?
Yes.
For 3 hours, cries of anguish were heard. At times, the cries of terror were lulled, and we thought it was all over, but the next instant they were renewed in still keener accents. As for us, all we did was row to escape from the death cries.
The sea is quiet now. The ocean is littered with motionless bodies and wreckage of the Titanic. Standing on a collapsible sea, I noticed that the wireless operator, Harold Bride, is amongst the survivors. I ask him, what boats are coming to save us? Bride answers with,
The Baltic, the Olympic, and the Carpathia.
In our little boat, we were frozen with cold, having left the ship without overcoats or rugs. We shouted from time to time to attract attention, but obtained no reply. A German baron who was with us fired off all of the cartridges in his revolver. This agonizing suspense lasted for many hours, until at last the Carpathia appeared. We shouted hurrah, and all of the boats scattered on the sea made towards her.
4 a.m. to 5 a.m. Carpathia arrives to pick up survivors. In New York, on the newsstands, the headline reads,
New liner, Titanic hits an iceberg! Sinking by the bow at midnight! Last wireless at 12:27 a.m. Blur!
Quartermaster Robert Hitchens tells the survivors of Boat 6 to ignore Carpathia, as she was to pick up bodies. Bonnie Brown and Chris Day cast off from Boat 16 and rowed toward the steamer. When Hitchens protests, Ollie threatens to cast him overboard.
It was just before daylight, I think it was. When we saw the lights of the Carpathia, we knew we were saved. The ship soon slowed down and approached lifeboat number 2. A rope ladder was thrown down to us, and the crew of the Carpathia helped us aboard. When First Officer Boxhall got aboard, he was escorted directly to the bridge. Captain Restron asked, were many people left aboard when she sank?
Hundreds and hundreds, perhaps thousands, perhaps more.
After a few moments, he finally replied, Thank you, mister. Go below and get some coffee and just try to warm up.
The most wonderful dawn I have ever seen came upon us. I have just returned from Egypt. I have been all over the world, and I have never seen anything like it. First the gray, and then the flood of light, and then the sun came up like a ball of red fire. For the first time, we could see where we were. Near us was open water, but all around us was ice. Ice 10 feet high was everywhere, and to the right and left and back and front were icebergs. Imagine some artist able to capture what we saw from that boat at dawn in that field of ice with that red sun playing off those giant icebergs. Then suddenly, like a streak of lightning, across the edge of the sky shot the searchlight of the Carpathia. I knew we were saved, and I began to look about me.
The captain stated he saw our green light 10 miles away, and of course he steered directly to us.
We did not wait for Carpathia to come to us. We rowed toward it. We were picked up at 7 a.m. We were lifted up in a sort of little sling that they lowered down to us. After that, it was all over. The passengers of the Carpathia were so afraid that we would not have room enough that they turned practically the whole ship over to ourselves.
When we pulled alongside, Mr. Boxall called out,
Shut down your engines and take us aboard. Only have one sailor.
The Titanic has gone down with everyone on board!
Just shut up!
We climbed a rope ladder to the upper deck of the Carpathia. The history of our treatment on board the Carpathia is known to the world, and it has been underestimated. We circled back to where the Titanic had gone down, and I saw nothing except quantities of cork. Loose cork floating in the current like a stream, nothing else. In the afternoon, I sent a brief Marconigram with the news that Mr. Douglas was among the missing. We heard many stories of our rescue from many sources.
After all the survivors had boarded the Carpathia, the ship streamed toward the harbors of New York. By this time, the press had received word of the Titanic tragedy, and calls started to stream into the White Star offices. As the time neared for the Carpathia to reach port, over 10,000 people crowded the docks. Swarms of reporters wanting to buy the rights to our stories desperately searched for any leads into the Titanic.
Rosa Abbott, the only woman who went into the water and still survived.
Soon, the raft tilted and all slid off into the water. Many of them managed to get back on it. Some did not. I managed somehow to get back on it, but I don't know how. Had it not been for Officer Lowe, I would have been drowned. I was nearly exhausted when he pulled me into his lifeboat. It could have been impossible for an officer to show more courtesy. And many of the criticisms that have been made against this man are very unjust. I was in excellent hands at the New York Hospital on West 16th Street. And I am deeply grateful for the consideration shown to me by everybody.
Might I say that Mr. Ismay was in no mental capacity to make a final decision on anything. He was taken by the idea and kept repeating it that he ought to have gone down with the ship since he had found that women had gone down. I told him there was no great reason. I told him a great many things. The doctor tried too, but we had difficulty arousing Mr. Ismay, owing wholly and solely to the fact that women had gone down with the ship and he had not. You can call the doctor the Carpathia. He'll verify this statement.
I was hurrying here to visit my son who lives in Medford, Oregon. His baby is ill and I had to get here to do what I could. I left my daughter in Paris. I'm going back in May. We are to visit friends in London. I have not been made afraid by my experience. I have no fear of water. For 15 years, I labored in Denver with Judge Lindsay in rescue work. When my time came, I did what I could.
When we arrived in New York, the crew of the Titanic was ordered to get off into the lifeboats before we could dock, so I sat in the desk chair and I listened and I looked. It showed me more plainly than anything I had seen the inefficiency of the crew and the number that were saved.
My husband did not come back again after he left me, and I do not know what became of him, except that his body was found, brought to Milwaukee and buried.
Meanwhile, the McKay Bennett, the cable-laying ship, was left with the morbid task of collecting bodies. But after almost 5 days at sea, many of the bodies were horribly deteriorating. Armed with a ton of ice, 100 coffins, 40 embalmers, and a cannon to conduct burials at sea, McKay Bennett only collected a total of 328 bodies.
After a 2-week holding period, mass burials took place.
Of the 1,523 passengers who perished April 15th, the sea was the final resting place for 1,194 of them.
The causes of the tragedy are varied and complex, and no single detail caused the incident, but rather a set of circumstances and decisions, and changing any one of them may have been enough to save lives.
The watertight bulkhead design wasn't exactly right.
Marconi wireless telegraph is still a fairly new technology, and ships did not rely on it as it would come to later as an integral part of operations.
Captain Smith ordered this ship to travel at a high rate of speed throughout the night. In spite of the one ice warning it had been confirmed that he had received, and the one that Lightoller posted in the chart room.
The unusual calmness of the North Atlantic made bergs much more difficult to spot for the lookouts.
The Californian was close at hand at the time of the sinking. So close that both Officer Boxhall spotted its masthead lights, and Captain Smith ordered a boat to row the distance between them. Wireless operator had quit his post, and the captain and crew completely ignored the distress flags and signals and never even thought to rouse the radio man. Had the Californian responded to any of the distress calls or signals, the passengers and crew of the Titanic could have been evacuated before freezing to death in the 28-degree Fahrenheit water.
Mr. Ismay, you indicated your willingness to supply this committee with any information or data regarding the construction or equipment of this vessel.
Any data and any information the committee may wish is absolutely at their disposal.
And your willingness to meet with the full committee?
At any time you wish.
That means surviving officers as well.
Certainly. Anyone you wish is absolutely at your disposal.
What are your own immediate plans?
I understand that depends on you.
Thank you, on behalf of myself and my associates, for responding so readily this morning and for your statements. I'm going to have to ask you to be subject to our wishes for the balance of these proceedings.
I am absolutely at your disposal at any time.
By the end of the inquiries, 25,622 questions were asked and answered. As a result of the inquiries, the Board of Trade drastically updated their maritime standards.
As to the attack on Mr. J. Bruce Ismay, it resolved itself into the suggestion that, occupying the position of managing director of the steamship company, some moral duty was imposed upon him to have remained with the vessel until it foundered.
Mr. Ismay, after rendering assistance to many passengers, found sea collapsible, the last boat on the starboard side being lowered.
No other people were there at the time.
There was room for him, and he jumped in.
Had he not jumped, he would have merely added one more life, namely, his own, to the number of those lost.
Of the 2,234 people on board Titanic, only 711 were saved.
Thank you.